Okay, so I saw now that already some participants agreed. So everybody should write that we do agree in chat. Thank you. So how to write a review? We have three great professors, great reviewers that accepted to contribute. So looking forward, and I also saw that you built this workshop together. So I think I should stop now, not to take too much time. So thank you again for accepting delivering this session. And so the professor that the first is Shlomo, yeah, Professor Tarba, would you start? Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
very
very
much.
much. Just to confirm, you hear me well and you see presentation, isn't it? Excellent. Thank you. So it's a pleasure and honor for me to present this presentation here. And thanks again for organizers, for Professor Dusage and for Dr. Anka for invitation. We had a brief discussion with my colleagues, with Alessandro and Xavier, and we decided to provide complementary insights rather than presenting the same things in order to make it more appealing and in order to avoid overlaps. And therefore, I'm going to focus on the editorial and guest editorial perspective. And I decided to call this presentation, to give it a title, From the Other Side of the Barricade, because many of us were acting as submitting authors, as reviewers, but also in different capacities as editors in various journals. So I think this slide would be maybe the best illustration of the peer review system as a quite streamlined process. It's very tough process, and if eventually you survive and get your paper published, it's obviously a great success, and we should celebrate because it becomes even more competitive. The everlasting, excruciating question, at least for myself, to guest edit or not to do it. And to tell the truth, many years ago, I promised to myself that I am not going to do any special issue, or I'm not going to serve in any editorial capacity because it takes a lot of time and energy from myself, and I'm distracted from my original research and so on. But every single time my colleagues approached me with a different idea, and it was very hard to refuse. And therefore, I found myself actually working on many subsequent special issues, projects, and so on. But how it started? It started from this model. This is a very famous model, and people working on mergers and acquisitions, they are obviously familiar with it. I know that Pierre published many papers on mergers and acquisitions with Lorenz Capron, and Javier is very active in mergers and acquisitions. I'm not going to explain, of course, this is not our focus now in this presentation, but this is a model for post-merger integration approach that I also tested in my PhD that I have done under supervision of Yaakov Weber at the time. And working on this model, I realized that temporal dimensions are quite important. Sometimes the acquirer needs to proceed in a very determined way, deliberately, very quickly. Sometimes actually it's very important to emphasize the slow pace, but sometimes there are also quite challenging situations like the symbiotic approach, and this made me actually it was quite confusing, the symbiotic approach, because I started thinking about the so-called ambidexterity in mergers and acquisitions, and later on I started my other projects in a broader context, not an M&A, an ambidexterity, because in ambidexterity you need to reconcile seemingly irreconcilable challenges, contradictory challenges. In the literature, the prevalent view of ambidexterity so far is the concurrent pursuit of exploration and exploitation, but this is a very limited view of ambidexterity. And this is how I started actually the diversification into different areas of agility, ambidexterity, and so on. So this is just a general context. Just to give you a flavor, a few examples of the special issues that I have done. I'm not going to explain about each of them, otherwise it will take several hours. You can see behavioral microfoundations of sustainability, ambidexterity and HRM, microfoundations of ambidexterity that we just completed with Sebastian Reich, Justin Johnson, Tom Mom. Also a special issue on M&A with Professor Kerry Cooper and colleagues. And also I worked on, among other special issues, I worked also on in the executive-oriented journal like California Management Review. And I was amazed that the style of writing in California Management Review and also Harvard Business Review, it's completely different from the classic academic writing that we are used in the other journals. So that was also a very rewarding, interesting experience in terms of the learning, because as a guest editor, you are learning a lot. So how it started? I tried to compile here the potential antecedents and also potential outcomes of being a guest editor. It's like a model, a conceptual model that we are building for the quantitative papers and so on. So what are the potential antecedents? Boredom, definitely not. You are not waking up one day in the morning and deciding to undertake such a demanding and time-consuming job. Ambidexterity, yes. And some people call it even triple or multi-dexterity, because you will have to deal with multiple challenges at the same time. Agility, a lot. Interest in the topic, absolutely. If you are not enjoying the topic, if you are not interested in a particular topic, the chances that you succeed in it actually will be very low. And of course, willingness to contribute to the academia and society. It is quite essential. By the way, in front of one recruitment panel at the time, many years ago, I was asked why I'm doing so many special issues. And my response was, because I want to contribute. I want to push forward the agenda of these topics. And I realized that this guest editorial activity is highly not recommended for selfish and egocentric people. Possible outcomes. Exposure, yes, but this is a double-edged sword, I would say, because of recognition along with many potentially disappointed, disgruntled colleagues across the globe, and the risk of losing of your friends, I would say, because eventually you need to do a very rigorous job impartially, which means many papers are going to be rejected, and some people obviously perceive it in a different way. Significantly deeper and up to the minute understanding of the topic. Absolutely, you are going to be one of the most updated, up to the last second maybe, in that particular realm. Personal satisfaction due to the contribution to the academic community. definitely. But there is also the danger of decrease in your scholarly outputs. So it depends. It depends on your particular maybe stage in your career. I wouldn't recommend. I wouldn't recommend to engage in guest editorial activity if you are still on probation, because obviously the expectation in your particular school maybe could be different, because first of all you need to show the output by yourselves, you need to publish by yourselves. Guest editorial activities maybe they fit the profile of more associate professor, and as you are progressing to the higher levels in the organizational hierarchy, let's put it this way, in your own school. But once again, it depends on the expectations in your particular school, and the preferences can vary from one school to another. A few words about the liability of foreignness, newness, and so on. And I myself, I experienced this, and therefore I would like to add a few words, because at the time I arrived to the UK, and the UK educational system was completely new for me. I arrived from Israel, and therefore sometimes you can face the potential hurdles in a new country, like lack of proven track record in terms of publications, maybe grants that you succeeded to hit, standing in the field, STEAM, and so on. Also, in terms of academic differences, it is quite important to understand in various capacities when you are a submitting author and also when you are a guest editor. It's equally important, I think. You need to understand what are the potential academic differences in terms of which type of research you are expected to conduct. I know that this should be our personal choice, but I think it's not a secret that in some schools there is a strong preference, for example, for a quantitative type of research. In some other school, there is a strong preference for qualitative research, actually. So I think this informal information, this tacit knowledge, you really need to invest in the competitive intelligence in order to understand what you are expected. And of course, such norms as order of authors, topics, journals, they are quite critical. In terms of target journal selection, and once again, I would like to underscore that these things are equally important when you are a submitting author and also when you are writing a special issue proposal. By the way, in leading journals, to get a proposal for the special issue, to get it approved, sometimes you need to revise and resubmit it at least 2-3 times. So it's like a paper, it's like a Foster level paper in terms of the amount of energy and time you are going to invest together with your co-editors. There is a risk sometimes of the dilution of your research portfolio too much in terms of variety and number of the projects, and therefore there should be a common thread. Many years ago, I was asked, what is the common thread, the unifying thread between, for example, ambidexterity, agility, and mergers and acquisitions? And the common thread is the fact that they are about the organizational change, how to instigate the organizational change, how to deal, how to cope successfully with organizational change. And as I mentioned previously, originally I started my work on mergers and acquisitions, and only later on started making inroads in other, but adjacent field, not completely different fields. Identification of the core journals. We need to be extremely careful, especially because we are living in the age of metrification, quantification, different rankings, In the UK, we are under rules of, obviously, under rules of ABS and so on. It's not automatically recognized sometimes, but obviously still that guide is still important in some schools. Still, they are looking at it, Hartzing, Google Scholar, and other rankings. And also there are differences between the North American orientation and European orientation in terms of the journals and so on. There was a question, sorry? Oh, okay. And also, I would say in some schools, as I know, they distinguish between executive-oriented and generally specialized journals. Many years ago, I attended an event in INSEAD, and it was quite amazing because during that event in INSEAD, I think it was in conjunction with EURAM conference at the time in Paris. Professor Maurizio Zolo and Professor Alfonso Gambardella from Bocconi University, they really called to all early career students, scholars. They actually said, wake up, because the academic environment in Europe is going to change. We are going to adopt the US system, the so-called US system. Start thinking about publication even during your PhD studies, because that tradition will be no longer valid, that you completed your PhD and then you have 2-3 years just to think, to contemplate about your future research agenda. That model is going to disappear. And it was quite important, I would say. It was like a moment of truth, for me at least. A few words about goal setting. I think that given the current market condition, and here in brackets, I'm referring to the report by Lord Stan. It's relevant only to the UK, by the way. But still, I think it's an imperative to publish at least 1, maybe 2 papers a year, and to have several papers at different stages in order to sustain your competitiveness, and sorry to say it again, just in case, mobility, if something goes wrong. Frequent and popular statements, and once again, apologies, put simpler, nice excuses. Someone is claiming he's not a member of the right networks, and therefore papers are rejected. It's harder to publish qualitative papers, to publish Foster level papers in finance, marketing. It's tougher than in other areas. We are familiar with this. So find the way, learn, come to early career colloquium, like our colloquium, and learn from others how to publish in those journals. Try to understand what are the expectations, what is the level of methodological sophistication maybe that you need to show. Try to collect primary first-hand data rather than using maybe some proxies, because everyone has access today to all databases, and it's very hard to bring novelty based on macro level data only. So there are ways to overcome these seemingly insurmountable barriers. A few words about the balance in while pursuing the diversification strategy. I think it's really important not to think in terms of a single paper, but in terms of a rather diversified research portfolio. But once again, under diversification or over diversification, as we know from the literature, from the strategic management, might be risky, and they can have a detrimental impact on our own performance. And I would advise to work on several projects at various stages, maybe one paper in preparation, the other under conceptual development, the other paper maybe at the stage of the data collection, and maybe some others under review, revise, resubmit, and so on. But once again, it depends on your time, it depends on the resources at your disposal, and so on. And the last word about collaboration. Is it a must or an option? Well, since I'm coming from the mergers and acquisition area, I'm a strong believer in the synergistic benefits, in the complementary skills, and I think collaboration can create really unique learning opportunities that previously we couldn't realize. However, it's absolutely vital to be clear about the terms of collaboration up front. What type of the journals you are targeting? What is the offer order? What is the maximum size of the team? Work distribution? Type of data to be gathered, methodology to be applied, and so on. This is very, very important to define the boundaries of collaboration, because otherwise the coordination efforts, they can dramatically increase the cost of collaboration and have a negative impact. So this is very, very briefly from my side, and I will stop here because we have a fascinating presentation by Alessandro and an excellent presentation by Javier. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing the screen.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting. Okay, I will upload like this. Thank you, Professor Tarba. I know that we were a little bit late and I also had a contribution. So my contribution was this. We'll continue with Professor Xavier Castañer. Thank you. We will, if you agree, in the discussion part, we can go a little bit from the break. So just yeah, it's a very interesting subject, and thank you. So I will ask you to consider 10 more minutes from the break.
All right, thank you so much, Anka. It's a pleasure to be with you again today. I hope that you can hear me well and see the slides. Great. If there is any issue, please let me know. The connection sometimes is not the best. And I will try to be relatively short because Alessandro has prepared really fantastic slides regarding the editor's position on reviews. This session is titled How to Write a Review. And we imagine that you all have some experience already in writing reviews. So we would like also to be able to address questions that you might have about the challenges that you face currently while doing reviews. And so that's why it's so very nice that Anka announced that we can go 15 minutes beyond schedule to address that. So let me just, before I start with my slides, tell you that two things. The first one is that you already know that, but I think that it's very important to highlight it, that reviewing is the central activity in my mind of our scholarly community. Of course, alongside with authoring, right? With writing, research, and submitting it. But as you know, as you probably have realized, reviews and reviewers actually take a very significant role in shaping what gets published together with editors, of course. And so in a way, you know, over the years, I come to think about reviewers and the editor, the action editor, as almost co-authors. Not quite, but almost, because we really need to address their concerns. Sometimes we might disagree and we need to justify. In a way, it's like the same kind of principle than in governance, in corporate governance, a topic that Alessandro knows a lot, and I have also worked a little bit. So you know that one of the norms there is comply or explain. So this is the same thing that we do, you know, as authors. We are either complying with what the reviewers tell us, or we need to explain why not. So the task, our task as a members of the research community of being a reviewer is really central. And in the field of management, we do it by and large for free. Grazie et amore, as they would say in Latin and or in Italian. That's something that we could discuss whether it makes sense, but it is really, as I was saying, with the reviewers that as authors we create the research that gets published or not. And so in that research that gets published, it's really what's the field knowledge being accumulated. So it's an extremely important responsibility. And I think that the organizers, and I know that Pierre is very sensitive to this, probably that's the reason why they included this session on how to write, hopefully, a good review. So I'm going to try to address that from the soldier's perspective, from the battalion of thousands of reviewers in our field. I have about 25 years of experience in the field. I've reviewed extensively for many journals and being in the editorial review board for many journals, including Academy of Management Journal, Org Science, SMJ, and so on and so forth, also from lesser known journals. And so I'll try to give you, you know, my take on what's a good review. And then I think Alessandro, as I said, will speak more about the perspective from the editor. So we, as Shlomo said, we try to be complementary. So you will see that when I'm presenting, actually what's a good reviewer is to a large extent a good researcher, right? Because we're basically expressing our opinion about a manuscript of scientific research. So in a way, right, we are judges, we are evaluating the quality of research. And so, you know, as I was preparing these slides, I realized that, you know, this could serve also as what's a good paper as an author. So I'll try to address some specific issues in the role of reviewer at the end of my presentation. And as I said, Alessandro has really excellent points also on that. So let's see if yes. So the first issue is what's a contribution, or what is a theoretical contribution that I will be addressing. As you know, most journals, most scientific journals, they will ask authors to contribute to the literature. And so what does that mean? So I will try to address that. So in discussing what's a theory and what is a properly formulated theory, I'll talk briefly about the nomological network and different types of contributions. Then I'll talk a bit about research design, the concept being coherence, content validity, just a few words on causality claims versus correlation, almost, I would say, not much about methods actually, and then the operational and ethical challenges of reviewing. So this is the menu of this marathon, short marathon on doing reviews. So let's get into the meat of it. All right, so what's a good theory? So, you know, my understanding is that it should based on assumptions. So that means that the authors need to be very clear on what are the assumptions that they are drawing from. They should explicitly mention them, right? We should not be guessing. We should be reading that into the manuscript. Sometimes is implicit in the use of words such as satisficing versus optimizing or maximizing, right? And this deals with the cognitive dimension of rationality, which is the main assumption in the social sciences, right? The other one is the motivational side on self-interest or maybe altruistic behavior. There are other issues about which authors can make assumptions, right? Such as individuals' information and so on and so forth. But the important thing is that they should be explicitly mentioned. So discussing, that I think is very important in a review. if it's not clearly addressed. And obviously, one of the main, probably the most important dimension will be coherence. So starting from assumptions, everything else has to be consistent with those assumptions. Then what is a theory? As you know, a theory should be composed at least of a hypothesis. Now, it depends on the field of management, in particular in finance and accounting. Many journals do not actually ask, or it's not conventional to have authors explicitly state the hypothesis. In some other journals, such as in strategy or organizational theory, it is actually conventional. So I would say that it should be evident that there is at least one hypothesis in the paper, right? And so what is a hypothesis? A relational statement that A leads to B, and there needs to be a good explanation. That it needs to be accompanied with a good causal argument. What is a good causal argument? It's one which makes sense, right? Which is logical. Why does A lead to B? Then, a very important thing, that I think is central to management, which is a relatively young field, right? Only 50 or 60 years of systematic scientific research. So, most research actually starts, most scientific research, such as Darwin, started doing a typology, right, or a taxonomy. Now, as such, this is not a theory, right? But it might be a first step towards a theory. And here we have the example with Porter's in strategy, typology of 4 generic strategies, right, with 2 dimensions, and then 2 kinds for each dimension. Is this a theory? Yes, it is. Maybe Porter did not state it clearly, but there are 2 hypotheses in Porter's work, which is that all should actually help in pursuing competitive advantage, but if you try to pursue both cost leadership and differentiation, you end up being stuck in the middle. So, sometimes hypotheses are not very clearly stated, but again, there should be some hypothesis that we should be able to identify in a manuscript if there is a hypothesis or not. And if there isn't, and the paper says that it goes beyond conceptual aims and it tries to develop theory and or test theory, well, if there is no hypothesis, it's not good, right? And so you should say it. What are the attributes of a properly formulated theory? Is that it should start, in addition with the assumptions, with clear definitions of the key terms. And this is one of the main problems that we face, in my view, in our field, which is still young. And actually, Pfeffer, former president of the Academy of Management, already in '93, so it's already 27 years ago, a long time ago, mentioned. And I have done some recent research, and in some fields, only 10% of the people actually define the key term. Right? And this is problematic because then we don't know what we're talking about. And in our nice management field, there is a temptation for term proliferation. So another principle of good scientific research, of what we call scholarship. So I would argue that not everyone who does research is a scholar, because not everyone is parsimonious. What does that mean? Really trying to use the minimal amount of concepts and relationships and hypotheses to explain a phenomenon. So these are very important. And so when judging a manuscript, when writing a review, it's critical that you assess whether this is parsimonious. Is this adding to the existing body, to the state of the literature? And that's why it's so important that the authors do a good lead review. Now, the problem is that currently most journals, unfortunately, and I know that there are several editors in the room, many journals do not want a lead review section. I think it's wrong. And they expect the author to motivate the gap in the first page and a half. I don't think that that's good for scholarship work. So I'm asking you to deviate maybe from what's standard practice now and go back to the good practice of the old days. And to avoid tautology, of course, you cannot include the term that you're defining in what you are in the definition. And this is very important. And the field does not really quite follow it. Unfortunately, we try to get support from our hypothesis when this is, of course, for mostly for empirical work, but already in formulating the hypothesis, there should be hypotheses, as Popper said, which can be falsified. And as you very well know, in the last 20 years, probably since Miles Shaver publication of his 1998 management science article, then the endogeneity issue has become salient, right? And with difference in difference and matching samples, empirical research, the issue of causation or causality has become central. So it is not just an issue for empirical work. It's actually something that we need to think about when writing theory and actually when evaluating authors' theory. So, what is the endogeneity here? What are the factors that could be explaining what we are mostly concerned with? And so, for instance, taking the example of corporate governance, most of the literature, I would say in the last 30 years, has focused on this link between the governance choices, board composition, and CEO incentives, and strategy, content, or performance even, but has forgotten the role of ownership, right? Owners, who the owners are, and what's the influence of owners on that? Well, these actually owners can have also an influence directly on the strategy that's actually being formulated, not just on the mechanisms, right? On the composition of these bodies, right? And on the remuneration structure, but actually in influencing how the CEO thinks about strategy of the firm. So it's very important to assess both theoretically and empirically, but also theoretically, the issue of endogeneity. I wanted here to give you, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with agency theory and its main, assumptions, and then, the main solutions that it provides: interest alignment on one hand, through variable compensation and ownership, but also through effective monitoring through an independent board, right? And concentrated ownership. I'm just mentioning that because now I would like to move on to the idea of nomological network, which is simply a visual representation of a theory. So, the links, which are the hypotheses between A's and B's. And so this is kind of the nomological network that, with Nikos Kavadis, my co-author, we kind of developed on the field of governance and the link of governance, corporate governance with strategy and performance. And what I want to use this is to tell you about how to assess whether a paper, while doing a review, is making a theoretical contribution, because we argue that the most important contribution, or the field argues that the most important highest level contribution is precisely in modifying the existing theory, right? Do we need to add boxes? Do we need to add other explanations? Or do we need to add or modify the links between the variables, the hypotheses? So in reviewing a paper and assessing whether it makes a contribution to theory, we need to, if the authors don't do it ourselves in our minds and try to figure out, is this paper providing a modification, modifying the nomological network in this particular domain? And what are the main types of changes in a nomological network? There are basically two. You can basically challenge the assumptions, right? And by challenging the assumptions, what something that was assumed now will become an independent variable. This is what Granovetter did with opportunism from Williamson, and then converted, saying, well, there might be trust sometimes, sometimes not. So then, that's one kind of theoretical contribution, very, very important, which I would say are the radical theoretical contributions in the field. And then you can add explanatory factors, boxes, which obviously at least one link to the other boxes, right? Or adding contextual factors, which we call moderators, and finally making longer causal chains, which are mediation. And here you have an example of the work that I did with Nikos Kavadis, who is currently at Copenhagen Business School, in our 2013 SMJ, which we added free cash flow and the direct, but very important, kind of mediated and moderated effects, right? So usually moderation comes with mediation, and I think that this is the main mechanism for theory contributions. And here we have adding the ownership factor, as in our most recent research, and even more recently trying to integrate agency theory with behavioral theory of the firm, adding the role of aspiration gaps. So as you see in red, there are new boxes being added and new relationships being added. And this is what, is an example of what is, considered a theoretical contribution in the sense of altering the nomological network. Of course, you can also make another kind of theoretical contribution, which is also very important, which is proving, right, or the authors can do, right, when reviewing, proving that a theory applies to another context, another industry, another kind of organizations, another country, another temporal period, right? And so this is about extending the generalizability, right? Bigger generalizability of a given theory by providing empirical evidence that the theory applies to these other contexts. But the theory is the same, right? So there is no modification on the nomological network. So these, I would say, are the two main theoretical contributions or contributions about theory. And I would add to that one of my recent kind of lines of work, which is conceptual papers, which, it's not about hypothesis, but it's trying to clarify the meaning of concepts, of key concepts. I would like to think that this is also theoretical contribution because concepts are the first building block of a theory. And to finish my presentation, hopefully in time, I would just quickly talk about some operational and ethical challenges that I believe are important. Probably you are already aware of them. And as I said, Alessandro will cover them much more systematically. It takes a lot of time. At the beginning, to review a paper, it might take one entire day. You read it carefully, you think about it, you make some notes, then you write the review as constructive as possible, thinking that you're having a nice dialogue with the authors, not hammering them, not destroying them, but put that yourself in the, as Alessandro would also say, put you in the place of the author as you were having a real conversation, right? And I think that improves a lot the quality and the style of the communication, which I must say, by and large, from the reviews that I have seen, is pretty poor in that regard. I mean, we are pretty harsh. Of course, there is a learning curve. You will learn to do this over time, so it might take less time. But still, sometimes there might be in areas you accept to review things which are not necessarily in your own area, which is problematic, but sometimes you feel that you have to do it to do some colleagues favors. And so then you'll have to read about other papers, right? What happens when you you have done a friendly review of a paper, then you're asked to review? Well, what I do is that I tell the action editor, I say, look, I already reviewed for this, friendly review, right? The authors had asked me to give feedback. And so, I want you to know, if you want me to continue and do the review, I'll do it. But so you're informed that I have some kind of a conflict of interest because I've been already given feedback to this and I'm sympathetic to this paper. I mean, usually that's why we call it friendly reviews. Usually we ask to friends, right? So we are kind of sympathetic to that work. And what happens when you have reviewed the same, the manuscript, right? Or pretty similar for another journal. And in particular, the authors have not made much effort to change it or to take into account your feedback. Well, that's problematic. That probably you will get upset, right, when you get that manuscript to review. And so again, here, I'll do the same. I do the same. I tell the action editor, look, I have already reviewed this paper for another journal, and the authors don't seem to have changed it much. So what do you want me to do? Do you want me to continue and proceed or not? And sometimes, most action editors will say, yes, please do it, because we are so overwhelmed with the work, right? And getting reviewers, it's so difficult. And Alessandro probably will talk also about that I'm co-editing a special issue with Alessandro now for corporate governance, international relations. So they'll probably say yes, but they'll say also, so please feel free to copy and paste. So from your past review, if they didn't do much changes. So this is acceptable because, it's kind of self-plagiarizing your review, right? But if they didn't do much changes, if they didn't address, it's considered legitimate. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention. And I guess I'll switch off my mic now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very important information, and thank you for bringing all of these interesting ideas. And yeah, it's complementary. It's really nice how it's the first workshop you deliver together, and it's great that things are running very smoothly. Thank you very much, and great timing. Professor Alessandro Zattoni will continue, and looking forward.
Thanks, Anka, for introducing me. Thanks, all friends and colleagues that are attending, that I had the pleasure to interact a bit before the session. Thank you for all the students that are here and for my two colleagues that introduced the topic. So I will try to give you a sort of understanding of the review process from different perspectives, from a reviewer perspective, from an editor perspective. And I hope to be useful enough to help you to write a review or to appreciate how important is to do review, because typically some of us are very much self-concerned about publishing, but you need to look also on the other side. So if you submit a paper, you need to do also some review. I was very strict when I was an editor or when I was a track chair in a conference, because I think we need to learn that we need to be generous with colleagues, and when you are part of the game, you need to also give back, and you need to be developmental if you expect developmental reviews and so on. So there is a reciprocity that is very, very important to me. So just a few information about my experience with review, so you can get an understanding about my personal view on review. So I did review for several conferences. Typically, this is you start with conferences, and I hope most of you do review at least for EURAM or other societies. Then you do several review for journals. They typically invite you. I will be more specific later on, or you can also ask to provide your time as a reviewer. Sometimes I receive also review for books, because publishers also ask you to do a review for books when they need to understand if the book can have a potential or not in some topic. Clearly, my field is corporate governance or strategic management and corporate governance. So this is the field I typically have been asked to do review. And I got a couple of awards for reviews, and typically this is nice. You put in your CV, it doesn't count so much, but it means that you take review role seriously. That is, I think it's important to be involved like this. Then I did, I belong to several editorial review board members of several journals. I did the screening editor. I will be more specific about the screening editor role. I'm currently a senior editor of a journal, and I also have been editor-in-chief. So I basically try to give you the different perspective you can have about the review process from both sides, the author side and the reviewer side. Anka, should we move any question at the end, or they can also interact during the presentation, as you wish?
As you wish.
For me, it's the same. Maybe at the end, because they didn't do any interaction with my colleagues, so it's better probably to have all questions at the end. Okay. But if you have something, I'm happy to answer immediately.
Thank you.
Okay, so what does it mean to be an editor, a senior editor, associate editor? Typically, you will be surprised maybe by what I'm saying, but when you are an editor, you want to give a paper a chance. Especially, I tell you from my perspective, most of the reviewers recommend a rejection. And the most generous typically recommend a major revision. So this is why I think when you are on the other side, you need to look also about the publication. And as an editor, I tell you, sometimes you also have a shortage of paper accepted. Because if you follow reviewer, you basically reject probably, the acceptance rate in good journal is about 5, 6, 7. And probably some of this paper the editor gave an R&R, a major revision, probably high risk revision, even with some rejection from the reviewers. So I think at the end, we need to give a chance. It is difficult to give a chance because you don't know the final outcome. So sometime also with Xavier, we are co-editing a special issue. If you see there is a possibility, you give a chance. Is a high risk revision, major revision, but you want to see, if you see there is a gem in the paper, you want to give a chance because you want to see how can you craft the gems. And I think Xavier was very, very good in presenting you what does it mean to provide a significant contribution in theory and an empirical contribution. So I don't build on this. Timeliness, I think, is quite important. So when you are a reviewer or when you are an editor, you need to check at least minimum once per week about your assignment, about sending reminders. And some journals are very strict on the turnaround time, is a key competitive asset of the journal. And so they typically keep an eye and attention on respecting the time, as otherwise is a problem. And sometimes a delay of a reviewer creates a problem to an author. And so this is why the editor, but also the reviewer, are asked to be involved. It may happen that sometimes reviewer need extra time. I receive sometimes this request. I try to minimize the extra time, but clearly, you know, especially in this period, you can imagine that several reviewers ask for extra time. It's a very difficult period for everyone, and not only submitters, but also reviewer. And so I try to be supportive of this. What does it mean to be an editor or an associate editor? I think it is important to have a role in the decision. So avoiding counting the rejection or the major revision. I think the editor should be very clear about how to develop the paper. And sometimes reviewers do not provide a good review, sincerely, and so you need to not consider too much. Sometimes they are very critical, you don't know why. Maybe they don't like the theory, they don't like maybe the person, you don't know if they know who is the other guy. So I think the editor role is much more than counting rejection or acceptance, is entering into the decision-making process, getting the best of the reviewer point, and try to focus on the major issues. So you need to typically to develop a letter. It should not be like the reviewer letter, should not be too critical. So you need to be able to build a developmental and constructive. You need to balance the weaknesses and the strengths of the paper, and clearly do not raise too much expectation if there are not expectations, but also to increase instead the challenge and to give very clear indication about how to do it. And if they do it well, you are very happy, and they did a nice job. And sometimes I think it's important that you provide clear indication about the 2-3 points to address and how to address if you are, because this gives sometimes a guidance to the author, and they are looking for guidance without changing completely the paper. It's their paper, but you need to be very clear about what are the options. And so I think this is the person that should take decision is working together with the author, with the reviewers, and try at the end to be able to bring some good paper to be published in the journal. So when you are an author, you know that you have a friend on the other side that is the editor, and the editor want to at least to publish some good paper. And typically also the reviewer should do this job. So some comments that maybe you also experience, or you can provide some question. There are very senior colleagues, they can provide their experience to you. I think the review process is very, very important in our field, because we try to be objective as much as we can, and we try to keep the academic standards. Clearly, academic standards are different from different journals. I will go back to this point later. But typically, we want to be sure that the paper that is published reach some level of qualification, some level of quality. I would say that when I was young, like you are, typically you were thinking that any paper published in a top journal will be perfect. And then, you know, you are challenging the PhD to do the review for this paper. You find there is always an issue. Any paper that is published has limitation, and obviously, because we know that there are trade-offs in doing our research. So we need to understand this trade-off between quality and limitation, and Xavier was very clear about the theoretical expectation that you have and the empirical expectation. In our field, but this is not true for any field, is a double-blind peer review process. So typically, the submitter don't know who will review the paper. He knows typically the name only of the person that will provide a recommendation, so the associate editor typically, or the editor-in-chief. On the other hand, reviewer don't know the name of the submitter. I think this is not the same in other disciplines like economics, for example. Today is a bit more difficult in my view. So I know, you know, maybe you met person in a conference presenting the same paper, or as Xavier highlighted, you may be asked to do a friendly review. So in this case, as also Xavier mentioned, you need to be very frank with the editor and say, he's a good friend of mine, I know the paper, I know who are the authors. And I tell you, from my perspective, I typically am not so negative. I really appreciate when you share this information. And I typically ask the person if he feels comfortable or not to do an objective review. I say sometimes they decline. They say, no, I'm too much of a friend. I don't want to be involved. Sometimes they say, well, I think, yes, I met these guys, but I know the paper. I like to be a good reviewer. I think I will be objective, developmental enough. So this is an editor decision, and I tend to be open like this. The editor process, the reviewing process involves different people. The screening editor is typically now several journals are including the screening editor because, as I said before, the acceptance rate is about 5, 6, 7%. So editor want to give a chance only to paper that can reach publication. And so today, about 50% of paper in almost any journal is desk rejected. So don't be unhappy if it happened to many papers. And the screening editor has this role to create a link between the journal and the submission. If you see that the paper doesn't meet the quality or the fit or the expectation of the journal, then you need to desk reject. If instead there is a chance, you may move on. I tell you, I played the role of screening editor for a journal years ago, and sometimes you can be surprised by what I'm saying, but you receive something on chemical plant in Nigeria, or you can get paper about everything. So that doesn't have any link with the journal. And so this is why the screening editor can save time from the other people involved. Typically, after the screening editor, the paper was reaching the editor-in-chief. The editor-in-chief read the paper and allocate to one of the editor, associate editor, section editor. There are different roles in journals. And then typically the editor allocate the paper to 2 or 3 reviewers. There are different traditions also about how to allocate paper to reviewers. Typically, what I do is try to allocate paper to reviewers that have a deep knowledge of the theory, or a deep knowledge of the method, or a deep knowledge of the topic or the country. So you tend to have people that have complementary perspective, but very good knowledge, so they can assess the paper overall on any dimension. Sometimes it's difficult to find the ideal reviewer because they decline, they have other appointments, but then you try to make a good mix. As editors, we typically rate your review. And we rate your review on a scale, depending on the journal, between 1.3, 1.5. And the rating is about both the timeliness. As I said before, journals don't like to receive review in very big delay, or they don't like to receive reviews that are very, very poor. They are done too quickly without entering into a dialogue. They are either very, very positive or very, very, very negative, but without an understanding of the dialogue with the paper, with the authors. I think this is important that you know, because as I will show you in a minute, there are a lot of problems with the review process, and this is why we try to avoid this problem, and this is why we try to have this assessment of the reviewers. Sometimes some journals, I think almost every journal or most journal and most conferences now provide a review award. So this is important because it gives you a kind of a feedback, both the feedback by the editor and the feedback of journals and the conferences give you a feedback about if you are doing a good job or not. I think this is good, it's a recognition for a job that is important for our academy. And so this is why I think I'm encouraging the society I'm currently a president to create a reviewer award. Just to be quickly, if you assume that the review process is objective and fair, well, yes, but we are human beings, so we have limitations. So there has been several studies here. I just mentioned one, but there are many, many more that basically did. They basically took the published paper, they revised a bit, but just formally in terms of name of the submitter, they resent to the same journal, and most of them have been rejected. So clearly there is not a perfect process, we know, and this is why we try to work to make it better. So it's probably not perfect, but it's the best possible method, like democracy in Churchill works. And so why it is difficult to do review? I think it's difficult because sometimes, you know, the topic are are not exactly the topic that you know quite well. Sometimes you dislike the paradigm, or you dislike the approach, or and then you tend to be very, very negative. We need to avoid this. Sometimes we are very busy. We have under pressure with our teaching. We are under pressure for our research. And so we don't want to invest a lot of time. We prefer to reject and do it easily. And this is a very important point, a lack of training. Because if you think about it, most of us are trained in doing research. While I agree with Xavier that doing a good research means also to be able to appreciate good research, but also we probably do not receive a lot of training about doing a good review. And this is something important. Before this meeting, I read several papers on how to do a review, and top scholars say, well, this is something I never been trained. I did it, I learned by doing, and this is something that we need to probably understand and appreciate. And this is why I think it's very useful to include also a session like this in this program. So, why the peer review system have some problems and how journals are trying to address this problem. Sometimes you see there are reviewers that are very, very, very critical. They don't enter into a dialogue. I think this is a big mistake. I think you need to enter into a dialogue. You need to understand the paper and try to see weaknesses and strengths, as I will say. Sometimes there are biased judgments that lead to the publication of paper that have some characteristic and tend to lead to the rejection of paper that have other characteristics. There are studies that typically approach several reviewers with two different works. One was much more complex in writing, the other was much more direct, and surprisingly or not, reviewers tend to appreciate more the very complex text. I tell you this because sometimes I read paper in the top journal, I don't understand at all the story, the writing, and probably even the reviewer didn't understand. But I don't recommend to do this. I think I like papers that are clearly written, that you can get the story and it makes a sense. Another bias is the confirmation bias. So we tend to publish papers that are consistent with what we think is good or is the reality, respect to papers that are contradicting the reality. And you know, sometimes this also led to ethical issues, because there are authors that create papers that are consistent with what we think is the reality, and they then create fake research. Clearly, there is also a prestigious university bias. Some author acknowledges in the paper I read, It is also the experience, I think, about everyone. At least the editors sometimes tend to give a credit if you come, because, you know, it's human. You don't have enough time. You think that if you come from a top school, you can be good, you can do it. If you come from an unknown school, probably it's more difficult. And this is typically done at the highest level, not at the reviewer, because you don't know, it's a peer review, double blind. Sometimes there is a dissensus among reviewers, so the editor role is very difficult because you need to take a lead. I don't like so much, I don't know, my colleague involved, editor that say either all reviewer are okay or I don't get the paper. I don't think this is the editor role. The editor role is to take the best paper and to move on the best paper. And so it's quite normal to have dissensus among reviewers because typically we have different view. So this is why the editor role should be able to build on the strengths of the different reviews and try to publish the best paper. How journals are trying to mitigate this problem? The first one is the paradigm. So any journal is focused on something, because if the variety of topics, the variety of papers create a lot of variation also for the reviewers, because you need to have reviewer for everything. So this is why journals tend to have their mission, their scope. They want to be very clear about what they are talking about. Second, in theory, you need to select board members, editorial board members that fit with the journal mission and scope, that have all competencies to analyze paper from a theoretical and empirical and methodological perspective, and they have a good quality. They can provide developmental reviews. Three, when you select a reviewer, I mentioned before, you try to see people that are complementary and do not overlap, because you want to say that you want to get different feedback on different direction and try to be able to manage the different pros and cons. Communication is very important. So I guess you also receive several decision letters, or you will receive from editors that are 2 lines about, you will see the comment of reviewers, please try to address as your best, good luck. This is not a good editor's letter. And so there are journals that typically create a narrative. They explain about the pros and the cons. They address the major flaws. They give you some guidelines about how to address. Because from my experience, sometimes if you don't have a dialogue with the reviewer or with the editors, you don't even understand what you have to do as an author to satisfy these people. So this is why it is quite important to be very clear about what are the issues and how to address the issues. And then as a reviewer, as an author role, also mentioned by Xavier, can even disagree. I try to disagree sometimes when I think they are wrong. It's a risk, but I think when you think they are wrong, you have to disagree and you need to defend your position, citing and building on research. This is quite acceptable to me. And finally, performance management. I told you before that we tend to rate our reviewer effort and so on. So a very important point is the review is specific for a journal. And in other words, when the reviewer, I think, should create a dialogue within the journal. That means try to make the paper fitting with the journal mission and scope as much as you can, so that the paper, if reach publication, create a dialogue and try to contribute to the success of the journal. This is why when you are an author, that there is a corresponding duty you have to. When you submit to a journal, before Xavier mentioned that sometimes you receive a paper that has been rejected by another journal and you receive exactly the same version of the paper. This is something you need to avoid, absolutely, because this is not acceptable. And you need to adapt the paper to the journal. You need to try to create a dialogue with the journal. You need to try to link with the conversation. You need to try to link with the theories, methods, or approach, at minimum, the journal guidelines. And you probably don't know how many papers are submitted without a fit with the journal guidelines, without creating a dialogue. And so I typically desk rejected most of these papers because they typically are inaccurate. They don't provide a good contribution. The etiquette of reviewers. We mentioned already several times. Also, my colleagues mentioned this. Be honest. Be honest. So, for example, when somebody receive a review by a person that I know, he asked me to do a review for a journal. Maybe I'm a member of the editorial board, but the topic, I don't know anything, or it's very, very far from my area of research. So I frankly say, if you need, I can do it, but please consider that this is not my topic of research. I can do a general review, and so I'm available, but please consider with this my personal limitation to do this review. I think this is fair, and we need to do it, because otherwise, we can provide not the expected review they are looking for. I tell you this because sometimes the editor are looking for reviewers, so they look for people they trust. But sometimes the topic is so far that is not my topic, so I cannot be the reviewer. And so we also mentioned, be honest about any conflict of interest, be honest about your time availability, and so on. And sometimes you can also suggest other reviewers that are good, that they can be useful for the editors. Be punctual, be on time, I think is important. So if you are in holidays, if you are a member of the editorial review board, sometimes you put, I'm not available in this period. If you are late, tell them in advance, and do not wait to be late before communicating that you will be late, so you can have a conversation with the editors. Be confidential. I think this is another very important point. The review process is double blind, but it's also very, very confidential. You cannot disclose idea about the paper with somebody else until the paper is published. And sometimes I know from colleagues there may be problem issues if people maybe, well, there are several stories about this, but my point is be very confidential. You are a reviewer, you are involved in a process, you need to give your best, but don't enter too much in a conversation about this paper and several other people. Typically, there are two formats to do a good review. One format is, typically this is a format that you do when you are young and you are very, very detailed. You go section by section, you raise all issues about any point, any word, any section, any paragraph. And this is good because you give you a full assessment of the paper. You raise all different points. You typically make the authors understanding all the weaknesses. The problem is with this method, you typically don't discriminate too much about major and minor issues. So for example, I received a review about a paper one day with 49 points about everything, from major issues about theory, method, or minor issues about typos, and they were in a list, number from 1 to 49. Yes, it's very comprehensive, but then what I have to do is a bit unclear. The other different format is to do pros and weaknesses and strengths very clearly highlighted, and this is quite important. You typically do this when you are a bit more mature reviewer. Typically, this is done for a gatekeeping role. So you want to be very clear to the editor, say, if they address these 3 points, the paper is fine with me, but these are 3 critical points. The rest can be easy to manage, but these are the 3 points. Sometimes you may feel that you are a bit detached and you don't have a comprehensive understanding of the research, and so you are too focused on the 3 big issues. So you can switch between these 2 formats. You can combine if you like, and typically the first one is more for younger and the second one is more for mature reviewer. I will skip the central part because I think Xavier did it. So I go to the end about what does it mean to be a good reviewer and what does it mean to be good reviewing. Well, first of all, remember that you are a reviewer, but you are also an author. So try to give a chance to the paper. And this means to create a dialogue. As a scholar, I sometimes receive rejection, like every scholar. Sometimes I think they are good rejection. The paper could be better. Sometimes I think they didn't put enough effort to understand the value of the paper. And you can see from different comments. And then, you know, when it's done, it's done. It's very difficult to come back and to reverse a decision. Editor typically stay with the decision. Second, help the authors. Find the nugget. So try to be developmental. Try to find the pros that you see in the paper that are not common in current research. Try to look about the value of that research and not only what are the weaknesses. Be open to alternative viewpoint means sometimes this is not a research that you like, this is not a research that you do, but there may be a value. And if there is a value, please try to help them to craft this value and to propose this value to other authors, to the community. Try to focus on key issues. I think this is a suggestion we see before, the two format. Even if you want to go on a very detailed, be very clear about the 2-3 major issues that you see in the paper. Sometimes it's a theory we see before with my colleagues, sometimes it's a method, sometimes there are problems that you can address, sometimes the problems are very, very difficult to address, or it takes too much time and you don't believe they will do. Try to be clear also in recommendation rationale. I tell you from an editor perspective, sometimes reviewers are not very clear. If you read the reviews, it seems that the reviewer really likes the paper very much, and then they recommend rejection to me. So try to be consistent in the tone, try to be consistent in raising the issue so that the author can understand if you are in favor or against the paper and which are the criticalities. Otherwise, it's very difficult also for the authors. They look to be very, very friendly reviewers, while they are completely at the opposite side. They really are against the paper for several issues, and they don't even raise some issues. So for example, sometimes I hate when I receive a rejection and the reviewer raised trivial issues in the last round they didn't raise before. So you need to be very, very clear about the major issues in the first round, to be consistent, building on the major issue that you see. Then if there are open issues that are coming new, okay, but you cannot go back. And try to provide guidance. So this is not your paper, it's their paper. So you need to help them to do their best paper and not to do what you would like to write and you don't have the time to write or you don't have the data to do it. So this is our job. We need to help other colleagues to improve their works, the work that they will authors. And don't take personally if associate editor don't mention too much in the editor's letter. Don't take it personally if the associate editor give rejection if you give acceptance, or acceptance if you give suggest rejection. And don't take personally if author disagree with you. Sometimes they can be more comfortable with the topic. Sometimes they have a better knowledge of the method or the theory. So try to create a dialogue and not to be evaluator all the time. So this is my final point, and then I leave the floor to all of you. This is a kind of synthesis of what I try to communicate with you. So try to evaluate the objectivity and the ability to review. So is your friends, be frank with the editors. Is my friends, I like his work, it's a fantastic job, I prefer not to do the review. Or if you think I met these guys in the conference, I attended the presentation, I think the paper is good, but there are pros and cons. If you like, I'm available to do the review. Focus on the potential contribution. As I said before, all papers that are published are have limitation. And so try to focus if the contribution is so good. What is unique about the data? What is unique about the theory? What is unique that you can find, which is the value of the story, and try to balance with the limitation. Offer details about strengths and weaknesses. Every paper has strengths and weaknesses, so try to be very clear about what you like, you dislike, and provide feedbacks and comments on how to address. So some reviewer only criticize. They see only the negative side, the downside of any paper, and they don't look about the quality or the value in the paper. So try to balance this. This is, I think, very, very important. Otherwise, every paper can be easily rejected. Give opinion, give comment, give your personal view, and don't give directives. Sometimes we tend to, as I said before, this is not our paper. This is their paper, and they need to be happy to publish their research. But you can improve them, and you can create a dialogue with them. And frankly, I would say sometimes I receive so very good comment from reviewers. They improve my research, absolutely. So be open as an author to build on the dialogue that the reviewer provide you. Suggest sometimes alternative ways to analyze data. This happened to me sometimes. They suggest to do a test. I didn't do it, or they suggest to collect additional data. Okay, fine, we do it. And I think try to be very, very consistent between the letter to the reviewer and the letter to the editors, because sometimes reviewers play this joke that I think is unfair. They are very, very positive with the authors, and then they recommend the rejection with the editor. This confounds the process. Authors don't understand if you are in positive or negative, and they don't know how to address your comment. Okay, thank you very much. I don't want to take further time, and I leave the floor to Anka if she wants to.
Thank you.
Coordinate.
We still, I kindly requested for 10 to 15 even minutes. So if there are still questions, it will be the moment to be addressed. Very insightful point. So yeah, maybe some comments, not comments, but or questions. For sure contributed, if not now, but it is also for now, for us to become better reviewers, and it means better scholars, better researchers. It was very interesting, and I have some words now here like battalion and yeah. I'm interested. So, what would you get if you disagree? Because you said, Professor Zattoni, that okay, you had moments when the tendency was to disagree, and you even yeah, go for it. Did it help, or it was only just to clarify some aspects?
Do you mean when there is a disagreement among reviewers about the merits of the paper?
Yes, yes.
I think as an editor, you have a very important responsibility, because our colleagues are sometimes looking for the publication for their career. Sometimes it's between tenure and not tenure. Mm-hmm. I see also people changing this job because they didn't get the publication and they were fired, and they have to do now. Most of them are consultant. I look about their profile. So you have a responsibility. You need to be very, very clear about the quality of the paper and to give an option if there is. And some of these people, sometimes you realize people also provide review that are done too quickly. So they say, okay, acceptance, but the review doesn't say anything. Or they do rejection and they are very, very critical, and they even don't say too much. Mm-hmm. You cannot build a decision on these reviews. You need to build a decision on reviews that are really balanced, and they try to create a dialogue, and they see strengths and weaknesses and so on. Mm-hmm. And then, as I said before, this is our decision. I think also Xavier and Shlomo, they at the end is the editor decision. So if you see two reviewers with a sloppy review that say rejection, and one reviewer with a great, fantastic review that say R&R or major revision, I typically go for the good review if it's consistent with my assessment. I don't count the reviewer option. Otherwise, sometimes it's based the process. So it's a bit subjective. Yes, it is. But this is why you need to rely on different people and to make it more objective as you can. I don't know if Shlomo and Xavier want to add something.
I would like to add, first of all, thanks again for this insightful comments, Alessandro. I think the role of the editor is of crucial importance. For example, in British Journal of Management, where I serve as a co-editor-in-chief, it is quite frequent when I'm receiving contradictory recommendations. And then there are several scenarios. If I see that the paper falls within my area of expertise, for example, if a paper is on mergers and acquisitions or alliances or ambidexterity, so I can assess by myself, obviously. If it is a completely different topic, then I can consider inviting an additional reviewer. That is also an option in order to make a final decision. But sometimes I tend to agree with Alessandro. If I see that one of the reviewers, especially the reviewer with a track record in that area, someone that I can trust, someone that has a solid track record, if he suggests a major revision and 2 others even recommend the reject, I tend still to give a chance, a high risk major revision to such a paper.
Thank you. And let's consider ourselves as early careers. So we receive the opportunity, the chance to review some interesting papers also for our research interest. But let's say we don't have expertise in the methodology, but the topic and the country we know. Should we accept, or when should we, or it's a matter of communicating, okay, this is our expertise, this is what I can provide. I don't know, I will not review a quantitative paper if my focus is qualitative. Is it something important? So should we when should we accept? And okay, you mentioned already, and I have it here, but I have this concern, like these are also opportunities for us. And as you said, we learn with the papers that we assess.
Xavier, want to answer, or Shlomo, or Shul?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Alessandro. My connection is not great at the moment, so I will switch off the camera to try to maximize the audio. So this is a very important question, I think. And I would say, you know, the journals usually ask for 2 or 3 reviewers. And I think that a well-constituted editor, and of course, Alessandro and Shlomo can correct me, but at least from my experience as an author, a well-constituted editor will try to get reviewers who collectively cover the different key aspects of a manuscript, knowing that no single person is usually an expert in everything, in the theory, in the phenomenon, and in the method. This is the 3 vertices of the triangle that Bala Chakravarty, when I was doing my PhD in Minnesota, you know, the way he depicted. No one is an expert in the 3, usually. So you shouldn't feel like you have to be, right? I think that the critical issue is, first, if you're being asked, it means that the editor, however desperate she or he is in getting reviewers, you are still a valid reviewer for the editor. So you should trust that there is a reason, hopefully a good reason, for you being solicited. And so then, if you think that you can at least contribute in one of these 3 aspects, the theory, the phenomenon, or the method, I think it's okay to accept. I have accepted you know, and I have reviewed many manuscripts in which I was not the expert in the method, right? It's not a method that I had used. And then, you know, usually it means that, of course, you can, as reviewer, do more work and try to familiarize yourself, or because the first thing, it's very difficult, it will take a lot of time, or you really assess the extent to which the author has clearly explained the method. And sometimes, you know, there are some new methods being developed, and it's incumbent, I feel, on the authors to actually explain very clearly what is the method doing compared to existing methods, and how it's a better method than other methods that you might be more familiar with. That would be my take. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe allow me for one more critical question, connecting that to the discussions we had yesterday. There are more publisher and publisher houses now starting with the reviewer recognition platforms. So you publish your reviews, or you make your review history officially. What are your experiences with that as an editor, as a reviewer? What do you think about that? And would you recommend that to our fellow postdocs to be careful here, or to work with that, to use that in a positive way? What do you think about that?
Shlomo, Xavier, do you want to take the lead? Go? Okay. Well, I am very frank and direct. I always refuse to enter into that platform and to register myself or to put any of the review that I did. So I don't like this idea, because if we want to stay with the double-blind peer review, I think we need to keep it like it is. Second, they are doing some business behind, and three, I don't like also journals that ask you, well, I understand the purpose, but I don't like very much. Some of the journals ask you, would you like to use this review for another journal so that they can start with your review? I say no. I mean, this is something that is specific to a journal. You cannot do it. So I understand the publisher have this problem today, but you know, I think you need to do something very specific to a paper, to a journal. You cannot move to something different. And I don't like the market for reviews, or if you think our career is not driven by review, so I don't understand why they want to collect the review. But I think instead, this is a very good initiative to talk frankly with junior colleagues about the reviewing and the editor role. This is what we have to do, in my view. But it's my personal view. I can be biased.
I would like to add a few words. Of course, it's a personal decision of each of us whether to share our reviews. This is not a recommendation in my capacity as an editor. This is just as a submitting offer, as a reviewer of the papers. I personally decline that invitation to share my evaluations with our journals. I absolutely agree with Alessandro. It is a journal-specific review, unless, of course, you received the same paper, as we have heard, that was submitted to another journal without addressing any previous comments. And frankly, I think the reviewing process itself needs to be better recognized for promotion, for tenure, and so on. When I was serving as a head of department, I personally gave it a well-deserved importance, well considering people, the junior scholars, for promotion or for their completion of successful completion of their probationary period. I think our community as a whole needs to better recognize and maybe to build the proper incentive structure for doing reviews, because they are critically important.
Yeah, maybe if I may add, I share Alessandro's and Shlomo's position. At the same time, I think that there is some thinking that needs to be done about the overall effectiveness and efficiency of the knowledge creation system for scientific research in management. To the extent that these initiatives will be driven, which I'm not sure, as Alessandro mentioned, if they would be driven by that concern that we are collectively better using our time, which is our main resource, collectively to produce new knowledge about management, then I think some of this makes sense if it indeed helps to speed the process, but still maintaining the scholarly values. And I would just encourage you that if you feel like this is a concern for you and for the field going forward as early career colleagues, please do bring it up to us, to EURAM, to the Vice President for Research. We are trying to take things in this new open science world, which sounds very good because it uses the adjective open, but when we look behind with the deals that the publishers are imposing on us, it might be not so good. And we need to stand for the field as a scholarly endeavor, I feel. So we really would like to encourage you to share with us as you go forward, as I said, concerns, because we would like to defend the scholarly values that our associations are founded for and uphold.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments and thoughts on that. And please let us know. And also a good recommendation to our early career scholars, be aware of journals acting unethically. They're also in the market, and they try to target especially early careers with, oh, you have published that great paper. Wouldn't you like to publish a variation of that paper in our journal, something like that? Be always very careful with these emails because these are normally not very professional journals, to say it diplomatic here, and always assure that you hand in journals with high reputation and not operating like in this market. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, thank you.
Stefan, I think this is a very important point, and probably we can do it quickly, saying that everything you do will be noticed, something for the positive, something for the negative. So don't do it the negative side.
Yeah, very important points. Thank you. Okay. One more minute from
Anka, can you say something that I don't know if
yes.
we give this message very clear? I think it's very important that all of you start to do reviews, start maybe with conferences, approach journal editors, for two reasons. One reason is, selfish. You learn how to write a paper if you do a review. You learn from other reviewers, you learn from the editors, and so you can do better research. Mm-hmm. The other one is instead generous. You need to give back. Yeah. As you are submitting paper to journal and conferences, and you expect to get developmental good reviews, you need to give back to your colleagues with good and developmental reviews. So these are the two rationales that I think should motivate all of you, like all of us, to do this job.
Indeed, it's a win-win for sure situation. Although, as mentioned, in Romania, they do not count, but it's about learning by doing, and as you said, giving and receiving, and it's normal to give. Sometimes before you get, or you get the learning. So it's a continuous process, and yeah, thank you very much.